Alex Howard, thanks for joining me on the Immune Resiliency Summit.
Thanks for having me, Jason. It's great to be talking with you today.
So we've gotten to know each other in sort of this health space, mostly around the topic of trauma, chronic fatigue, and these types of things. And I think we both share a passion for really bringing this subject to light because it's such a underlying driver for things. And I'm curious, really, how did you get into this sort of chronic fatigue and trauma-based understanding? Where did that come from for you?
Yeah, well, I think like many people in this space, I didn't, as a sort of young boy or kind of teenager, dream of becoming a health professional. It wasn't I think I wanted to be in a punk rock band or something was sort of my aspiration for life. And then in my sort of mid to late teens, I developed chronic fatigue syndrome. And, initially, like I think a lot of people that start suffering with symptoms of a chronic illness, I didn't have any idea what was really in store for me in the years that followed from that point. Initially it was assumed that I had a virus, and I went and saw various doctors and was told, it could be 3 months, could be up to 6 months before you get back to normal functioning. I remember when I just turned 16 at the time, and just like 6 months seemed like a lifetime. Like the idea of being at that point, I had symptoms of pretty severe fatigue, muscle pains, dizziness, headaches, being, utterly exhausted, but often unable to sleep, which is a sort of odd combination. So then, 6 months seemed like a long time, but then 6 months became a couple of years. And a couple of years into this experience, it wasn't like I didn't want to die. I didn't want to end my life. I wouldn't say I was actively planning suicide, but the thought of continuing my life the way it was at that point just seemed utterly unbearable and impossible as an idea. And I think one of the things that people often will incorrectly say around many chronic illnesses, and I think it's also true of chronic fatigue, people will say, oh, well, maybe it's just depression. Maybe the reason why you have these symptoms is just because, you're depressed and you need to get out more and sort of do more activity. And of course, this point, I tried many times pushing through, pretending nothing was wrong, and it always made it worse. And what I would try to explain to people, but not very articulately at the time, was I was depressed, but I was depressed because my whole life had been devastated by the fact that I was suffering from a severe chronic illness.
And that's something I see too a lot with people, is that there is this sense of like, I don't want to live anymore, but it's in this way, right? It's like in a sense, you want this person or this life that I'm living to die, but it doesn't mean I want to end my life, right? So there's something deep within somebody that I think can be expressed in that way of like, this is not how I want to live. Like, I can't imagine living this way much longer.
That's the thing, particularly as I'm sure it's true in different ways at different stages of life. But for me at that point, as a teenage guy whose life revolved around playing sport with friends, playing guitar in bands, and not being able to do those things, and the sort of devastating isolation that comes when your friendships are based upon activity and you can't do those activities.
Yeah.
So at this point, I had a conversation with my uncle, and my uncle was he was a bit like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. You remember Lord of the Rings, where it's like he wasn't there very often, but he'd sort of turn up and have just like the right words of wisdom. They sort of disappear off into the sort of horizon again. And he had this conversation with me where he really helped me realize that if I wanted the circumstances of my life to be different, then ultimately I was going to have to be the one to change them. I could wait for scientists and medicine to find some miracle drug that would fix the situation that I was in. But I was pretty aware at that point, I was already 2 years into this experience, that was pretty unlikely. And, we're now 22 years after that conversation, 24 years after I first got sick, and there is no miracle drug. So I'd still be waiting. So that catalyzed what became a 5-year journey of doing everything that I could to find a way to turn around my health situation. And that meant I started doing a daily meditation yoga practice, radically changing my diet. Saw, I think, over 30 different alternative and um, allopathic practitioners. I spent my entire student loan pretty much taking supplements. And there was no one miracle answer. There wasn't like the one thing that I did that sort of, which would have made my career quite simple, really. I could have just said, here's the one thing, and everyone goes off and does that. It was different things helped at different ways. And part of what that did was influenced a model of different subtypes and stages and systems, and the sort of enormously fascinating but complex jigsaw of how all these different pieces can fit together. But after 5 years of this journey, I made a full recovery, and ultimately I went on to set up the clinic that I'd wanted to exist in the years that I'd been ill. And the Optimum Health Clinic's now been going for 16 years, has patients in 45 countries, team of 20 full-time practitioners specializing in this area. But I think part of the reason why my story has, for me, been important in understanding these sorts of conditions, and particularly in the context of this summit around immune function, that I was enormously resistant to the idea that my mind and my emotions were having an impact upon my body. In fact, it was one of the few things that probably gave me a temporary lift of energy, of just total frustration and rage, of the sense of feeling totally not seen and totally misunderstood in the physical reality that I was experiencing. And yet, half of the focus of the Optimum Health Clinic and my primary focus as a practitioner is looking at the impact of our mind and our emotions on our physical body. And of course, our immune function is a critical part of that.
So, I mean, I'm guessing stress plays a huge part in this, this journey for you. And we often hear about stress, especially as it relates to not only immune function, but chronic fatigue and even trauma-based things. So I'm curious, well, first, let me ask you, how do you define stress, right? Because that's a big one. And then I think the other thing is what is that relationship between stress, as we might think of it, and how the immune system functions? And I'm curious how that was how you discovered that in your path.
Yeah. So I would talk about stress as being, if we go back to sort of the real sort of history of stress, we're talking about physics, and we're talking about an excess of load. For example, if you're building the kind of structures of a house and you have stress upon those supports, is that stress too much, or is that support strong enough to be able to hold that? Stress isn't ultimately a bad thing. When we go to the gym to build muscle, we deliberately place stress upon the body. We tear a muscle, and actually the muscle, in repairing and growing stronger, that is the process of building muscle. How I define it being different is what we call a maladaptive stress response. When what's a healthy stress response starts to respond in a way which is unhealthy. So a healthy stress response would be, you and I are walking down the street and we go out to cross the road and we don't see the enormous juggernaut or bus or whatever that's flying towards us. And in that moment, we get a hit of adrenaline. And that's not a bad thing. Like, that is our body's way of trying to protect us from the immediate danger that we're facing. So that's a healthy response. And in that response, we get a hit of adrenaline and cortisol, and our body is immediately ready to fight, flight, or freeze. In fact, if we go back to the sort of biological sort of history of this, take another example, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, I don't know how many years ago, a lot of years ago, you and I are walking along and we've just been sort of, hunting some buffalo to have for our dinner. And suddenly out jumps a saber-toothed tiger. And in that moment, we've basically got three physiological choices of what we're going to do. The first is we fight. So we take on the saber-toothed tiger. I think you're probably a bit more athletic than I am, so maybe that's your preferred choice, but it's not mine. My choice is to flight, to run away as fast as we can. There's also a third response. We could freeze. And that could be in a couple of ways. We could feign death. We could pretend that we're dead and hope that the saber-toothed tiger therefore sees us not being as a threat. Or we could freeze in the hope that it doesn't see us. So these responses in the nervous system are designed as ways to respond to an acute, immediate stress, like a physical threat in our environment. That stress response is healthy. That's not something we want to turn off. In fact, turning that off, we wouldn't survive very long in kind of historic days. We wouldn't survive very long in modern days either. When we have ongoing stress day after day that's happening in our life, what we would call a chronic stress, one of the things that happens is through a process of ongoing overload and overwhelm, our stress response starts to potentially become maladaptive. That means that we start to respond to things that are not necessarily dangerous. So an example might be that mobile phone rings or we get an email and it's just a message that's coming in. But if we're massively ramped up and we're wired and our nervous system is overstimulated, then the phone going and the whole system jolts in a stress response to that. In fact, there's been a lot of research over the years looking at the impacts of stress on immunity. Quite a bit of this research has been done studying students around exam time. A couple of reasons why. Firstly, students are easy to recruit for research studies. They're always happy to get paid a bit of money. But also you've got a sort of a very predictable and measurable source of stress that's happening, which doesn't have ethical issues. You know, if you want to take a group of people and cause potential trauma or stress to them, it's hard to get ethics for that. So we have an enormous amount of research that shows the impact of the short-term stress of exams on students. And you know, one of the original papers back in 1986 in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine, they took blood samples of 34 medical students a month before exams and on the second day of exams. And if you can remember back to your student days, Jason, I certainly remember a month before having a good time. During the exams, like massive, like
it wasn't
panic.
Yeah, it wasn't until like, you know, the day before when I really started to get in there. So yeah, I was having fun until then.
In fact, I remember at my first year at university, a few weeks before the exams, looking at past papers, and I didn't understand the questions.
Yeah.
I was like, this is bad. It's like, it's not that I can't answer the questions, and I actually understand the words in the questions. So, you know, this example of one study on the day of examinations, significant declines in a whole bunch of measures, but particularly natural killer cell activity. So natural killer cells, as many people will know, their job is to look for immediate threats in terms of viruses, dangers in the environment, and to adapt and respond to them. We're under stress, our immunity goes down. I also think it's really interesting looking at, people might say, okay, well, that's just immune function, that's sort of up and down. Interesting research in 2012 in immunology and allergy clinics in North America. And they did a meta-analysis, but particularly one study that I really like quoting. They were looking at the impact of stress on the body's ability to heal. And I think it's quite surprising they got ethics of this, but they did punch biopsies, like a sort of mini kind of muscle biopsy on the non-dominant arm of, and the active group were people which were active caregivers. So they were in roles of caring for elderly relatives or disabled children, or whatever it may be. And those that were in roles of caregiving, those that had the ongoing stress and the kind of the pressure of that, those biopsies took 24% longer to heal. So just simply the body's ability to respond to a wound is taking significantly longer, not even through an acute stress, but just through the chronic ongoing stress of dealing with a burden like that in one's life. How this, to answer the sort of final part of your question, in terms of how my interest and sort of my awareness that came into this, one of the things that I noticed on my own healing journey was, you know, that people talk a lot about the impact of trauma in people getting ill in the first place. I mean, that's very valid, and I think it's important research. People don't always talk about the traumas or the impact of suffering from a chronic illness. When you don't, particularly where you have fluctuating symptoms and you have a medically unexplained illness where it's unclear what you should do in any one moment. Do I rest? Do I push through? How will I feel tomorrow? Will I be able to go to the wedding that I've been invited to in a week's time? We end up in this ongoing state of stress about symptoms and about how to manage the life that we're trying to live. And what I noticed was when significant things were coming up, in fact, I talked about exams. The first, towards the end of my A levels, sort of so pre-university and then university, for a couple of years that I was particularly struggling with chronic fatigue, I had relapses a few days before the exams because rising of maladaptive stress response, will I be able to cope? Will it be too much? System crashing as a result. So noticing that correlation in my own healing journey was sort of what catalyzed my interest in that relationship. And a lot of the work that I've done over the last 16, 17 years has been looking at when we switch off a maladaptive stress response, when we calm the nervous system, what impact does that have on the body's ability to heal? And sometimes it's marginal, it's part of a much bigger picture. Other times it can be quite dramatic. And the way that I would describe it is, for the body to heal, it has to be in a healing state. If we're in a stress state, all of the body's resources are going to fueling and maintaining the stress state, and those resources are needed for the body to heal. And just one final thing I'll say on this. If we look at food intolerances, multiple chemical sensitivity, like the immune system overreacting to potential threats in the environment, it's a little bit like, I remember the London bombings, and people would go on the underground and people would leave. I think it was 2005 that I'm talking about. People would leave their gym clothes on the underground, and no one would really care. Post the bombings, the heightened sense of fear and the heightened sense of arousal in London, where I live as a city, was someone would leave a bag on the tube and the whole network would shut down, and everyone would be running and panicking in that short-term period, particularly afterwards. It was a maladaptive stress response. It was a disproportionate response to the actual danger that was there. Same thing happens in our immune system. When our nervous system is hyper ramped up, our immune system becomes hyperreactive. And one of the things we often see is people, almost a sign of progress for some people on their healing journey, is they actually start to respond normally, like they get a cold for the first time in 10 years because their immune system has been so overreactive. They've not got normal illnesses, but they've reacted to a whole bunch of things that are actually not a threat. So one of the things that we notice when we calm that maladaptive stress response, often we also see not just a calming of those sensitivities, but a rebalancing of the function of the immune system.
So it's like it's redirecting its resources essentially to something that's going to be a little bit more conducive to restoring balance to the system, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's right.
And I find it interesting too, as you were sort of describing some of those circumstances, I'm thinking of where that shows up in my life. And one of those is, I don't visit the doctor anymore. It's just, I do my own thing, but that's one I think about when I think about the noticeable effects as people go into the doctor, right? They actually have a heightened stress response, which I think is an interesting thing to recognize. But another one is the airport. So, this is obviously one of those things where we see a lot of people get sick in travel. And I think a lot of that has to do with, of course, the environmental conditions in a plane and at 30,000 feet and circadian rhythm disruptions. But one of those other things is that every time I enter an airport, it's stressful, right? We got the TSA, we've got the timelines of things. There's lines. Everybody just seems to be a little bit agitated. So it's interesting that we have these circumstances in our environment where the system is naturally going to fluctuate in these instances, and rising sort of stress levels in the body are going to result. And so I just think about these things in these various circumstances in our environment, and clearly they're going to be disrupting immune function, disrupting all of the patterns in our body.
Well, it's interesting you give the example of the doctors, because actually I was just remembering that during the years that I had chronic fatigue, going to doctors was always quite traumatic, because I would have the fear of, will they believe me? Will they think it's all in my mind? Are they going to be helpful? Are they going to do I had a few quite unpleasant experiences of feeling, in no way maliciously, but feeling slightly violated by not being warned about certain investigations, physical investigations and things, that for a few years after I'd recovered from chronic fatigue, I remember registering. I'd moved house and registering with a new GP. And one of the things they do as part of that is they take your blood pressure. You have to go through a sort of series of tests. And I had high blood pressure. And I was like, I don't have high blood pressure. What's going on? So I went home and I bought my own blood pressure machine and I tested it a bunch of times and it was fine. And they said, well, come back. I went back and I had high blood pressure again. And I realized what it was my body was going into a state of stress, going into a doctor's surgery in a medical environment because of the trauma that it experienced. And then working with that and sort of using various techniques to calm that, and I was able to go back and get a clear blood pressure test. But it's really interesting as well that often the patterns we have and the ways that we've learned to respond are not always conscious. It's not that we're necessarily aware these things are happening. In fact, I think it's a disproven analogy now, but it sort of helps make a point that we used to talk about taking a frog and putting it in a glass of boiling water and it would jump straight out. You put it in a glass of cold water and you gradually heat the water and it will stay in there and get cooked because it doesn't notice that gradual shift and change in the temperature. Same is true of stress in the nervous system. I've sat in front of patients where I've been explaining maladaptive stress response and they'll say, I don't have any stress, but their body is they're almost like they can't sit still in the chair. They're sort of swinging in the chair and the whole system's sort of ramped up. They've just normalized to being in that state. And I think that's true of many different patterns that we can have, that we don't initially recognize it as a problematic thing. It's just how we know ourselves, how we feel we're wired. But it can be having an enormous impact on many elements of our health, including our immune function.
So when you're talking about these sort of personality structures and personality types, is this something that you feel is primarily or at least partially guided by our experiences in life? Or is this something that we're born with? Like, this is just who I am?
I think it's both. It's a sort of interesting psychological debate. Is it nature? Is it nurture? And I think the truth is that both are relevant. I think, and it's sort of interesting having 3 daughters and just noticing that, sure, my wife and I have slightly different stages of our lives as they're born and got hopefully a bit better at parenting as the years go on. Ask the kids in 20 years. But there's something that's different about the sort of innate sense of different beings, so I think we do come in with certain characteristics and certain elements, and whether one wants to put that down to DNA or down to one's soul, or there's lots of different models of how we could look at that. But then the way that we are responded to in our childhood also has an enormous impact. That in fact of course, there are many different personality patterns, but particularly in the context of health and healing and sort of impacting upon one's body, there are sort of 5 patterns that we've sort of categorized over the years in the context of working with people with fatigue-related conditions, but they map very much across to many other conditions as well.
And this is a sort of a map that you guys generated based on your experience and probably, of course, with the other work that's already out there by a lot of other psychologists, Bowlby perhaps, and maybe some others.
Yeah, that's right. What I'll come to in a second, I take no ownership for the sort of identifying of these as personality characteristics. I think what we've done quite well is understood how they correlate within the sort of health journey, and particularly some of the ways of sort of working with these. But the sort of part of the backstory here is Anna Dushinsky, who was the original director of psychology at the Optimal Health Clinic, who these days teaches and develops our therapeutic coaching practitioner training program with me. She and I were trying to make sense of. So one of the things that was happening in the early years is patients would come in and we would do things, particularly looking at things like mitochondrial function and giving some of the raw ingredients towards mitochondria, like, D-ribose and coenzyme A and various things. And we would give patients, they'd get more energy. And it may also be we were giving support to hormones as well. They'd get more energy. And then within a few weeks or a few months, they'd crash again. And it was like, what's going on? Like, people are getting better. And then as soon as they get better, they're sort of going back and living their life in all the ways that caused them to get sick in the first place. So this was a sort of trying to make sense of what are the sort of energy depleting psychologies? What are the ways that we live our life that are inherently draining and demanding to the system? To put it in the context of immune function, what are the ways that are living that cause our body to be more likely to be in a maladaptive stress response, which is then causing our immunity to be impacted and compromised? So I'll sort of name them, and then I'll just say a little bit about each of them. So there's the achiever, is where we sort of define our self-worth by what we do and what we achieve in the world.
Can I
There's
can I just raise my hand on that one? Because that was a pattern that I strongly ran for much of my life, and of course I think it's still there, but it's something that I've been working to bring into better balance, let's say. So anyway, I just wanted to raise my hand on that one.
You're welcome. And one of the questions that comes up is, can you have all of them? And the answer is yes. And actually, that's an important point. Actually, before we come in, I just want to respond to that it's not that having achiever characteristics is fundamentally bad or wrong. It's what's the place from which we're doing that, right? So it's possible to be driven, to be ambitious, to want to make things happen in the world, but your self-worth not be defined by those things.
Right. It's like an identification with it, or having it as an asset in your sort of tool belt, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You know, it's sort of, if your self-worth is defined by what you achieve, you're going to have a disproportionate relationship to those achievements. And as soon as you've achieved something, because you're trying to fill a hole on the inside, you're going to get there, and you can't fill inner deficiency with external stuff. So you're going to...
Yeah, sorry, I want to interrupt you there, and I'll have you continue. I apologize. I'm just kind of, I want to ask you, it seems like, and I think we kind of addressed it at the beginning of this segment here, where some of this is nature, some of it's nurture. In other words, some of it we come in with this sort of a general personality perhaps, and some of it's laid down. I can speak for myself that a lot of that was laid down to fulfill a need, right? To fulfill that need that I had to feel that worth, and achieving or succeeding in certain things allowed me to get that, right? So yeah. I noticed that was the case for me. I'm wondering if that's the case that you see for most people that you work with in this sort of chronic fatigue model.
I think so. And I think, you know, just staying on the achiever for a moment, you know, part of my conditioning in my childhood was to cut life story down to like 30 seconds. You know, my father left soon after I was born. So my mum had to work 3 jobs to support us, which meant that my grandmother played a highly influential role in sort of raising us day to day, because my mum was busy working. And my grandmother had grown up in an environment where there hadn't necessarily been a lot of money, and she'd worked hard, and she'd done well given her sort of where she sort of come from, in a sense. And so she placed, which I sort of understand much more now as a parent, but she placed an enormous, what I felt at the time was a disproportionate value on achievement and education. Mm-hmm. Of course, now as a father of 3 kids, it's like I understand it a bit more clearly. But what I felt at the time, what I sort of learned was, if I was second in a test in the class, why weren't you top? If I got 99% in a test, which one did you get wrong? Why did you get it wrong? Like, the focus was always on having to achieve, and whatever you achieved, never quite being enough. So I learned a strong conditioning around that. Mm-hmm. I then had a chronic illness, and in time learned to deploy that achiever pattern to that recovery path, and partly recovered because of achiever pattern, but might have done it more quickly if I had done it more in a more measured way, let's say. So I had reward and conditioning towards that pattern. But there's others, like I think about other people I know in my life, or people that I've worked with, that the achiever pattern just isn't really their thing. So if we come to some of the other examples, so there's the helper pattern. It's similar to the achiever pattern, but it's also very different in the sense that our self-worth is defined by what we do for other people. So rather than it being about achieving stuff, it's more about being there for others. And the sort of the classic helper example is, you know, you get home from work and you're tired, you had a long day, and you've been sort of dreaming of Netflix on the sofa with, you know, a sort of nice dinner. And then you get a text message from a friend who's having a bad time with their, you know, partner or whatever. and you go out and have dinner and look after them instead for the evening. And of course, being a kind, good friend is a good value in life, except that's become the story of your life. You're always the person that gets the phone call. You're always the person that ignores your own need to be there for other people. And just like with the achiever, it's a way of being a helper, which I think creates the world we all want to live in. But if our self-worth and our value as a human being is tied to that pattern, then it becomes unhealthy and it becomes imbalanced. And you can sort of see how, just with these first two examples, they're inherently draining ways of living in the world. Mm-hmm. And we start to listen to the achievement or what we're doing for other people over what our own body is asking of us. And that's fine for a month or a short period, an acute period of time. But if that becomes the sort of fundamental way that we relate to the world, it's not surprising that our system becomes depleted. And after a while, our nervous system starts to ramp up because it's trying to sustain us, because we're getting drained and we become tired and wired. The wired is a compensation to try and make up for the fact that we feel drained and depleted. And just to complete these five patterns, the third is the anxiety pattern. This is where the world feels inherently unsafe. And one of the things that often happens in an anxiety pattern is we try to think our way to a feeling of safety. So we have a sense that we feel a bit shaky, that, you know, that we're constantly, the world doesn't feel safe. And we deal with that by constantly imagining, what if this happens and that? And we're replaying conversations, and we're planning later. And we're trying to think our way that if I think about it enough, then I'll feel safe. The problem is, you can't think your way to a feeling. You have to actually drop into the body. That feeling of safety is there, but it's not in the mind. It's something that happens when actually the system slows down and learns to regulate in a healthy, functional way. The fourth of these patterns is a sort of, in some ways, a subset of the achiever pattern, but it has its own unique characteristics. It's the perfectionist. It's where in a sense, it's not necessarily about self-worth. It can be more about our sense of safety, that the world is only a safe place if I do things right. And, you know, there may be history around, you know, unpredictable parents. And when we did things right, we got rewarded for that. It might be that, that details give us a sense of comfort. And the more we sort of go into detail, the more we think that then we're going to feel a sense of safety. And the fifth is the controller. It's where we don't feel safe in the world if we're not in control. And so this can come out in sort of macro ways of sort of, you know, trying to control, you know, by leading and being in charge of everything. But it can also come out in sort of micro ways where we need to be in control of the temperature in the room. We need to know sort of when stuff's happening at what time. And again, you can sort of see with these examples, they're just inherently draining to the system, that it's like there's this sort of endless efforting that goes in to sustain these patterns. And the more ongoing efforting there is, without the kind of natural reset of the system, without the body naturally coming into a healing state, that we become increasingly depleted. And it's almost like we're that student at exam time all of the time in our life, or we're that caregiver who's taking 24% longer to heal a wound because we're ongoingly under the stress of these patterns. And these patterns are often self-perpetuating. So what happens is that achievers tend to create lives that have a lot of pressure and demand that require them to constantly achieve. Controllers tend to put themselves endlessly in positions of leadership where then they become responsible for everything else that's happening. You know, helpers end up helping everyone because that's their, so we end up with the patterns there, but we also create a world that perpetuates those patterns as well.
I love that. And just to sort of give a framework here too, I think it's important to recognize that this map that you're pointing to it's just a map, right? Like, I think a lot of times when we see these types of things, we want to be rigid with what they are, and everything has to fit neatly into a little box. And there's like yes or no, or go or no go if you're into the mechanical spaces. But it's like there's a blend, there's a gradient, there's multiplicity here. There's it's not an or, it's an and, right? Like there's
Yeah.
so much fluidity to these things, and the map is just a guide to help us understand something that is a bit fuzzy otherwise. Is that a good way to sort of frame that? Would you
Yeah,
agree?
100%. In fact, I have a 12-week coaching program, online coaching program, the Reset program. As part of that, I give people little questionnaires to help them identify these patterns. And sometimes people will sort of email us in, or they'll comment in the Facebook group and they'll say, I don't meet any of these patterns. I do this. Does that
Right.
count? I'm like, yes, that counts. It's like some people will really identify what I've just spoken about, and some people won't. But hopefully it'll trigger their own reflection and go, and the question that and the kind of tracking back to the overall focus of this dialogue, the question that I ask people is, ongoingly day to day, is your body in a stress state or a healing state? And if it's in an ongoing stress state, that is impacting upon your immunity, that is impacting upon your body, that is impacting upon the relationships in your life. If your body is in an ongoing state of stress, the question is why? And these 5 energy depleting psychologies is one map that we can use. There's many other maps that can also be helpful. Some people will perfectly identify with a map. Others, some people will be like, oh my God, I'm all 5 of those. You guys just totally described my life. And others won't. But it hopefully becomes a jumping board to understand what is that ongoing activation of my nervous system.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so cool about maps, right? Is that when you see a map and you identify that this is a good map, it doesn't get you to the end. Like it just shows you the territory, the landscape, so to speak, and then the next job is to navigate the map and figure out, how do I get to that destination? And so that can become the next step in the journey. And I'm curious, from your perspective, how do we take that next step, or what does that even look like? Because if I'm hearing this map for the first time, or maybe I've seen other things too, and I'm starting to get a picture of my patterns and my character structures, and perhaps even where they came from a traumatic place, or just a child psychology and child development. How do I begin to, I guess, take the next step, and how does that impact my nervous system?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I'm a great believer in the value of self-awareness, that if you can see it, you don't have to be it. The very ability to be able to identify and recognize the patterns that are happening, that already gives us a level of perspective and a level of distance. That then gives us choice. That if one can see, oh my God, Alex and Jason just talked about this achiever pattern. They both self-confessed to an achiever pattern, and I recognize I'm in the club. If you can see that initially, okay, you just see that as a sort of global pattern that you have. The sort of next step is, can you see that in actual examples in your own life? Like, can you perhaps sort of reflect, actually, yeah, I can look back on the last week and I can see I didn't need to go the extra hours on that. I didn't need to start that new thing. I didn't need to go and buy that car I couldn't really afford to look like I was like, if you can start to see those examples in your own life, that sort of, so you go from the global to the more specific. The next thing is, can you start to see that pattern in real time as it's happening? So it's not just a sort of reflective thing that you can see some examples in your life, but you're in a moment where, let's say, it's towards the end of the day, your body's telling you that it feels tired. Perhaps if you have allergies or something, they've been a bit heightened over the last few days, and your body's telling you it needs to rest. And then you sort of look at your to-do list and you think, oh, I need to get ahead of next week. And if I deliver that early, I'm going to sort of win the sort of, like, you see the pattern start to come in, and you make a choice to not go down the old path. And sort of the way our brain and nervous system work, through the process of neuroplasticity, we wire our brain towards habits. If you can break that habit, if you would have consistently gone down that path, and you catch it and you start to train yourself down a different path, that awareness allows you to start to break the habit, to break the conditioning that's there. So the awareness level, I think, is enormously important. I think that the sort of second piece is, often we need strategies to help us do that. So the first thing is the maps, and we talked about one, example of map, but there's many maps. We then need the strategies to start to break those habits. And, there's many different strategies that are out there. Things like mindfulness can be very, very helpful just to generally learn to calm and settle the system. There are patterns, within the reset program that I teach. We teach a series of techniques to break conditioned patterns, something called the stop process, where you catch yourself and you stop a pattern and you rewire a new pattern. Strategies around working with the underlying issues and emotions that are often going on. So as you touched on a bit earlier, often these patterns are set up in childhood, that we've had experiences and we've built habits and narratives and patterns in response to those experiences, often as ways to survive, as ways to make sense of the
And these
world
are subconscious, right? Like they're not usually, until we bring consciousness to them, they sort of reside in the background, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's often where the awareness piece becomes really helpful. When it comes to sort of cognitive patterns, awareness can get you quite a way, but often we still need some techniques to change things. When it comes to more trauma-based, emotion-based things held in the body, awareness is a helpful first step, but it's often not enough to actually move what's happening. And so a lot of the work that I teach people through the reset program, and also sort of in other sort of formats, is learning how to work on our relationship to our own emotions and body. And what a lot of us have learned to do is to effectively live in the mind as a way of escaping the feelings and emotions that we don't know how to deal with in the body, and actually learning to shift our relationship to our own emotions, to start to effectively learn to reparent our own feelings and emotions, to learn how to feel our body, to connect to it. That piece can be important as well, because otherwise what I notice happens is if you only work on the cognitive level, for some people that's going to be very effective. For other people, they're endlessly having to redo the same work because there are deeper issues that are going on that are fueling those patterns in the first place. And it's a little bit like...
Yeah, sorry, I want to bring one to example that just coming to mind, and let me know if this is a decent example of what you're talking about. Something that I've noticed in myself, I see it in other people too, and there's other ones too, but this tendency to criticize, like immediately, right? And it's like verbally or mentally, I'm looking for that thing that can be fixed, or another one I see in people is this negative undertone that always seems to just come out, and or this yeah, it's like they're constantly negative, and they'll even catch it. And so it's, in other words, it's a belief or it's a mental process that comes to the surface. And even with cognition, you can recognize it, but it continues to run. And so you can do these like little catch patterns where it's like, oh, there I am. Okay, I see it. And you're constantly working to reduce the tendency, but there's something underneath that's just like spewing it up. And it's like you can't get to the final conclusion, even though you're catching it all the time, because it's like it's coming from a different place.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think, what I would sort of call the inner critic, which I think you're describing that, or in Freudian language, a superego, that structure, you can go a long way with learning to defend against it and sort of getting some distance and getting some awareness. But there's also a place that you have to look at. What's the underlying sense of self-worth and self-value, and how is that structure sort of working with that? And learning to fundamentally look at our own relationship to ourselves, because what happened to us as kids happened, and the impact of that is still in the body, and working to heal that is really important. But what it's also done is we've taken that model of how we were responded to, and that's how we now respond to ourselves. So we had a feeling as a child and our feelings got ignored. What do we do as an adult? We have a feeling and we ignore it. But how do we ignore it? By constantly achieving the whole time. So all this stuff's happening in our outside world, but we're negating the feelings on the inside. And until we learn to shift and to work with that, and to fundamentally heal what's happening there, we're sort of endlessly running to escape that. And I know that it's not always a popular thing to say in the sort of popular psychology world, which is often about positive thinking and mindset, which, all has its place, and not to negate that at all. But ultimately, you can't heal what you don't feel. and we have to also work on the level of emotions and feelings. And, techniques like EFT, I have a lot of respect for. I think they're great. But there can be a danger of, oh, I've got an emotion, I need to start tapping it away, as
It's like a
opposed to
management.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah, as opposed to actually that place of genuine vulnerability and openness to our own feelings, where we're actually starting to reconnect with ourselves on a deep level.
Yeah, I agree. And this is something that I have a lot of familiarity with. I do a lot of this deep emotional work, this trauma-based work, child development, child psychology, going back into all these things. And I'm with you. I actually think using any and all of these tools and techniques like EFT, meditation, breath work, like they're all valuable. And I think they can be used both as management and sometimes to even release, right? And I think there's deeper work oftentimes, and I'm speaking from experience here in the sense that, boy, it's not fun. Like the emotions that we've avoided or that we've protected ourselves from, right? In other words, when we have these emotions, particularly in childhood, where they're too much, they're unbearable, they're unmanageable at that young age and of development, we built these structures to avoid having to feel them because it's so unsafe. We don't have another to help us regulate or to help us feel safe in those conditions. And I've had to go back and feel some of those, that I can sense stem from, 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old. And it's like a deep, deep pain. It's a deep,
Yeah.
deep hurt, a deep, deep anger, a deep frustration, whatever it might be, sense of betrayal. There's all these things, and they just are not fun to go back and feel. And yet, I think over time, I've actually learned to enjoy them. When
Yeah.
I get in there, like in the moment, it kind of sucks. It's a really icky feeling. You can feel it in the body. And then as it's expressed, like you get this sense that is something that is deep, and it's not a transitory experience in the sense that it's going to be there again for you to feel. I mean, maybe, right? Especially if there's a lot of layers, but it really is truly a feeling of release of something that has left you for good, and something else comes in to fill that
Yeah.
void that is a little more balanced.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's something that's very interesting when you're really feeling, be it deep pain or deep rage, that's very painful, but is also very beautiful because you feel deeply connected to the truth of your experience. And if I, the first sort of 5-6 years of my career was very much focused on the cognitive side, calming the nervous system in terms of the kind of thought level. And then I went through a period where I had unbearable panic attacks for about 18 months. And I was like, this is kind of a bit inconvenient. It's like I'm supposed to be the expert in this work, but in my own life, I'm in this like state of just my nervous system being completely kind of ramped up. And I ended up doing a number of different sort of retreats and explorations and psychotherapeutic work. But it's never down to any single one experience, but one way of articulating that piece of my journey was that I got in touch with, well, firstly, the fact that I just couldn't feel emotion, like I was emotionally numb and shut down. And then the entry point was the unbearable rage and hatred towards my father that I mentioned earlier, had left soon after I was born. And the enormity of that rage, I mean, I screamed in a way that I'm surprised I didn't tear my vocal cords. And it wasn't just once, it was like over a series of a particular session, but also multiple, of just the most murderous hatred and rage that wasn't cognitive and rational.
Yeah,
Like I
you
could
can't fake it.
understand the
Yeah,
story.
yeah, you
Yeah,
can't fake it. Yeah.
you can't fake it and you can't rationalize it away. Like there's just, but on the other side of that, my relationship to my feelings and emotions was fundamentally changed. And the panic attacks almost immediately stopped happening because I could come into my body. Before, I'd come to my body and it was so terrifying. I'd go back into my mind and I'd be terrified there. I go back to my body. It was like this kind of bouncing between two places of terror. To actually be able to come home to the body, you can't fully come into your body until you feel and connect and process with the emotion that is held in the body.
So it's really like what we have to do is we feel these emotions at some point and they fail to get metabolized. So they get stuck. And then what we're really doing, it sounds like, is we're kind of finally metabolizing these things that are stuck within us. And it's sometimes just not very comfortable as we do that. Sometimes I actually find that some of these things can be quite pleasurable and blissful as they move through, really. But oftentimes it's a little uncomfortable. Would you agree that that's kind of what we're doing, is we're finally metabolizing these things?
I think so. I think that those emotions are stored in a cellular way. They're literally, and you can see that sometimes in people that, kind of shoulders are sort of hunched up, or sort of, that you can actually see it in the body. Other ways it's not visible in that way, but as people start to connect with, and sometimes things like biodynamic psychotherapy, like massage in a psychotherapeutic way, will help open actual areas that emotion is held in the body. But exactly, it's a process of digestion and metabolization. And I describe it as being a little bit like digesting a meal. It's like the first thing you do is you chew on it. And the chewing on it is the sort of reflecting, and it's the talking about it, and it's the thinking about it. But then you sort of swallow when you're not so much in control. And you're sort of, there's a process of, in your stomach area, of sort of breaking it down with, hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes, and sort of the breaking down and the sort of tearing apart. And then you go for a process in the small intestine of like assimilation and absorption, and then ultimately expulsion. And there's that process where we're active in it, but there's also a place we have to surrender, and we have to trust our body knows how to metabolize and process emotion. We don't have to do it. We have to get out of the way of our body's ability to do it. And the conditioning and the patterns that we've learned are interrupting a process. Or it's sort of like eating a meal and just sort of not chewing it and just leaving it there. And then it becomes, it goes off, and it becomes a sort of poison after a while, because it hasn't been metabolized and been digested.
So there's so much here, and I want to hit on a last little topic here. And when I say little, I mean, it's actually quite massive, but you and I share the love of Dr. Robert Navio's work and the cell danger response. So I would love for you to sort of bring that into the conversation here, because this is, I find, to be a key piece when it comes to stress, the nervous system, chronic fatigue, the immune system, because it has to do with mitochondria. So I would love for you to share with us the cell danger response and how this ties into this whole equation.
Yeah, so to put it in sort of simplest terms, Dr. Robert Navio is a professor in San Diego, in I guess near you in California, and a lot of his work, and he's done work particularly on chronic fatigue, but he's also done work in many other areas, including autism and allergy responses, is looking at how is the body responding to danger and to threat. And one of the ways that I really like that he talks about it, which kind of appeals to my sort of lack of deep scientific understanding. Some people are very good at the sort of deep science side of it. But one of the ways he talks about I really like is really the mitochondria. They have two quite different functions. People often are aware of the mitochondria in their role of cellular energy production. The mitochondria also actually help activate and differentiate within the immune cells. There's also a key role in immune function. But there's that sort of energy production kind of role. But they also have a second function, which is danger signaling. So when we're under threat, when our system is in what I described earlier as a maladaptive stress response, our mitochondria change in their function. So they deprioritize energy production, immune function, the things that we want them to be doing, so they can danger signal. So it's sort of like they're the canaries in the coal mine. If we think back to, the kind of coal mining days, coal miners would go down and they would take a canary with them in case there was a gas leak. Canary would sort of go unconscious, and that would be the warning sign to get out. That danger signaling is necessary survival. That's what our mitochondria also do. When we are in a maladaptive stress response, we are fundamentally shifting our cellular function. Our mitochondria are deprioritizing what we want them to be doing so they can protect us, so they can warn the rest of the system we're in danger.
So real quick, because I think we sort of jumped over maybe something for some people who aren't familiar with mitochondria, but I love what you're saying here. So mitochondria are these little organelles that exist within pretty much every cell of the body except for red blood cells, right? So some of the tissues have a few mitochondria, some of them have thousands and thousands, right? The ones that need a lot of energy, like the heart, the liver, the brain, these things, they have a lot of mitochondria, because there's a lot of energy that is needed in those certain tissue types. And so what you're saying is that what we all typically think of mitochondria for, which is energy production at the cellular level, they do something else as well. So they have this energy production mode, and they have a cellular defense mode. And so these things, this is happening all throughout the body in basically every cell.
Yeah, I'm glad you added that bit. I was sort of mindful of time, but I was like, mitochondria. No, exactly. The mitochondria, they are, in a sense, the heart of our whole body's functioning and system. And it's not just the energy production piece. I think it's a helpful metaphor to understand it. As you say, it's every bodily system that ultimately is being impacted. And people that have sort of experienced calming a maladaptive stress response, I was sort of saying earlier, some people can have quite a miraculous response to that. Feel the difference. It's not just that your nervous system feels calmer. You can feel your whole system starts to respond in a different way. And it's not just single bodily systems. It's almost like the mitochondria, as you say, they're within all of the systems. And so it's a multi-system impact when we calm that response. And it makes sense that under danger, when we're under threat and under danger, the body doesn't have an endless supply of resources. So it has to prioritize what it's going to do. And if we're under threat, we need to prioritize surviving the threat. But if we're under threat all of the time because the stress response has become maladaptive, that has an enormous impact upon not just our sort of overall general health, but also things like immune function, things like energy production, things like digestive function, things like hormone levels. So it's not just, oh, you calm your system and you feel better. You are directly impacting upon multiple systems and how they function within your body.
So you're essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? Like you're stealing the potential energy that you can generate to run a lot of programs in the body to keep things going in a healthy and balanced way. And you're using that potential energy over here as a defense signaling mechanism to turn on these cellular defense warning, because there's a perception, and I'll say that all perceptions are valid, but there's a perception, and I think in your terms, maladaptive stress response going on. And so that is, you're kind of robbing yourself of energy. And is this what you feel is the underlying sort of mechanistic driver of chronic fatigue?
I think it's one of them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I would say for some people, it's the primary one. For others, it's the second or third or fourth. But, even where you've got a chronic fatigue case where it's clearly, a Lyme co-infections sort of overload of the immune system. So someone's like, oh, well, Alex, none of this is relevant to me because I got a Lyme diagnosis, got bitten by a tick 10 years ago. And here's my sort of results that sort of show that. What I would say is that it still stands that for the body to heal, it has to be in a healing state. And if your system is in a maladaptive stress response, you're not going to have the resources that you need to deal with those loads on your system. Does that mean if you calm maladaptive stress response, everything else is going to miraculously be fixed? No, you may well need other protocols to work alongside that. So for example, at the Optimum Health Clinic, we have a whole functional medicine nutrition team working with those other elements. But as an almost prerequisite to the effectiveness of those other pieces, we first have to calm and reset the nervous system.
That makes sense. Wow, Alex, there's a lot here for people to chew on, but I think it's so relevant. The way that we deal with stress, what is really the underlying driver of stress, and it's so often missed. So I appreciate you sharing all this. Where can people find more about what you do?
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so people can go to alexhoward.tv, which is my website, and on there they can find sign up for a free 3-part video series which goes into this in much more detail. So this is kind of a 3-part series introducing the reset program, talks about the maladaptive stress response in more detail, cell danger response in more detail. We look at polyvagal theory. So that's a great way, if people have resonated with what I've been talking about in this interview, to go to alexhoward.tv, fairly near the top, sign up for that free 3-part video series. And what we've sort of been doing here in an hour, it's in more detail over sort of 3 hours unpacking it. I think people will find that really helpful. So, and then if they want to find out more from that, the Reset program is really the place that over 12 weeks, I take people in groups through this in much, much more detail and much more, not just theory, but really getting in the trenches of the tools, the techniques, the strategies to calm the system, work with emotions, listen to the body, work with the inner critic, many of these pieces that we've been touching on.
Beautiful. Well, I think it's so important to get a lay of the land so that you know what you're working with. So I would encourage people to go check that out. Really gives, I think, even just understanding this stuff lowers stress in a sense. It's like, oh, finally, I can understand what I'm dealing with and I can take the next step. So Alex, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Jason. Thanks for having me.